Yes. Well, that shows there was no white race. Right? I mean, and that solidarity testifies to it. And reading that leads to the question, well, how then and when did the white race come into being, and what purpose, for what purpose was it brought into being?
Well, how did it change? How did it come about? How was it invented?
Well, I define racial oppression as a system under which the least, most degraded member of the oppressor group is exalted over any member of the oppressed group, however educated or wealthy. And what this came about in my argument here, that in that the ruling class was faced with a mass of dissatisfied, armed, poor people who made this rebellion, and they were put down, but they were still armed and they still dissatisfied, and had to be, so they cast about for some means of maintaining social control.
Now, in the first volume, you give a lot of attention to Irish history and Irish American history. What relevance does that have to racial oppression?
Well, I treat the British rule in Ireland in the early period, the 13th century, the 1200s, and then again after the Reformation, the 1560s, until, and then most intensively after a couple of wars in the 18th century, the regime called Protestant ascendancy. Protestant ascendancy is like white supremacy. Under that law, no Irish Catholic could own land, could purchase land, could not rent for long periods of time, could not practice as a lawyer, and of course could not vote, and was deprived of the elementary rights of Englishmen.
Now,
and all of them, not just the working Catholics, laboring class Catholics, but all Catholics of whatever class.
So you're saying that they took this type of oppression and they applied it to the Africans that were enslaved here?
Well, what I'm saying is they overlapped some, well, particularly in the 18th century. And in the colonies, in Virginia, a law was passed in 1723 that Negroes, Indians, and Catholics, Irish Catholics, could not have the franchise. They couldn't vote. And there were, that's a thing that indicates the kinship of the two systems. But in the continental colonies, in plantation colonies, Virginia and Maryland, where they started, the motive for it didn't depend upon what had happened in Ireland. They were, just as in Ireland, they were confronted with the problem of social control, and so they used the Protestant versus Catholic system. Here, to maintain maintain social control, the ruling class here, the plantation bourgeoisie, established a rule in which they sought to enlist all European Americans as whites in the system of control, even though they themselves were poor and downtrodden themselves.
Now, in your second volume, I think the point is driven home even more so about how the systems of oppression were different between the slavery in the British West Indies and the slavery on continental America. And I think maybe an explanation would help explain the difference in the racial oppression there compared to here.
Yes, that's a very, very important aspect of this treatment of the subjects, because if it is said that, well, as some historians apparently assume or say, well, there's a natural tendency of the whites to dominate, right?
Yeah, but now in the West Indies, it had something to do with the numbers, right?
Yes, in the West Indies, in a characteristic of the United States, Anglo-America, continental Anglo-America, was the denial of social mobility to African Americans, free African Americans, not just bond laborers, but the free African Americans were denied the rights of citizens. And at one time in Virginia in 1693, I think it was, they passed a law saying though free Negroes, persons who freed Negroes must pay for their transportation out of the colony. In other words, to keep down free Negroes as well as bond laborers.
So, in the Americas, if you had 1 ounce of African blood, you were considered African American,
Yeah.
and you could not move up the social ladder because of the African blood that flowed through
Yeah.
your veins. But in the British
that
West
was
Indies,
done, but yeah, now that was, and in the West Indies, after a certain period, almost beginning even before the 18th century, the ruling class there, the British ruling class, was recruiting some persons of one degree or another of African ancestry into the middle strata, in the militia, and in petty trades, and they became important in the merchandising of, not of the sugar crop, but of other things, and they became landowners, and they became owners of bond laborers themselves.
so they were allowed to move up the social chain.
They had to allow that, because there was no way of controlling the Negroes, as they said it. And this is formulated in my book. I mean, I have pages where I cite several of the English authors who say we need to promote the mulatto and some blacks to an intermediate strata, so they will be on our side, on the side of the whites. Mm-hmm. And that works pretty well for a long time. And the heritage of it is seen today in West Indian immigrants who have come here already experienced in functioning in the petty bourgeois strata of society, whereas in the United States that was considered an affront to the poor whites to have a Negro be a merchant or be a supervisor or anything of that sort. But there, the difference is this, that in the West Indies, the British West Indies, there were too few European Americans to recruit the sufficient middle class, intermediate social control stratum, whereas in continental Anglo-American colonies, Virginia, Maryland, elsewhere, there were too many European Americans to be recruited into that class. So they promoted them to what? The white race.
So the white race is particularly unique to continental slavery as opposed to the British West Indian slavery. Now, what hope do you have for anyone who reads your book? What is your hope? How would they take something like this and use it in their lives today? How would this influence?
Well, I would hope first that any reader will read critically, and test what is said there. And say, well, does it hang together?
Yes, and it is very well documented, I must say.
Yeah, there are a lot of footnotes, and I think, some of them are substantive, and they need to be given attention. So read it critically, and then I hope that it may be found a contribution to strengthening the struggle against white supremacy.
Okay, now the music that you hear is called Points, Facts, and Reasons. And I think it's an appropriate song for today's show because you've made a lot of points, you've stated a lot of facts, and you've given a lot of reasons. And I really appreciate you coming here. Mr. Theodore Allen can be reached at Verso Publishing at 180 Varick Street, and he has an email address. What's your email address?
twallen1 at ix.netcom.com.
.com, okay. And